Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to dive deep into a recent Joe Rogan Experience episode with comedian Felipe Esparza.
Yep.
The guy had some wild stories and interesting observations about all kinds of stuff from like the old school Boston comedy scene to life before modern conveniences.
Right.
It's going to be a fascinating ride, so buckle up.
I think what's really interesting is how Esparza blends humor and social commentary. You know, he'll have you laughing one minute, and then the next he's making you think deeply about the world around us.
Right. Okay, so let's start with Esparza's description of the Boston comedy scene. Like, way back in the 90s. It sounds intense.
Oh, yeah.
He talks about these legendary Boston comics like Don Gavin, Kenny Rogerson, Steve Sweeney.
Yeah.
And they were known for their hard-hitting acts and their,
Oh, yeah.
shall we say, colorful personalities.
Yeah. Very regional, very Boston. You know, it was a different era for comedy.
Right.
These guys were products of their environment, you know.
Right.
A very specific local scene where you had to be tough to survive.
Yeah.
Esparza talks about how difficult it was to follow these guys, especially for headliners who were used to playing to softer crowds.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine going from a polished set in L.A. to a room full of rowdy Bostonians.
Oh, yeah.
Ready to heckle you at a moment's notice.
Right, right. It's fascinating how the comedy scene has evolved since then. I mean, think about someone like, say, Bo Burnham.
Right.
I mean, his humor works all over the world because it's so accessible and relatable, you know, thanks in part to the internet.
Totally, yeah.
But back then, you really had to tailor your act to a specific audience. Maybe that's why those Boston guys developed such a distinct, hard-hitting style.
Yeah, and I think the internet has just completely changed the game. It's democratized comedy in a way, allowing comedians to kind of bypass the traditional gatekeepers, you know,
Right.
and connect directly with their audience.
Mhm.
It's also created a more globalized comedy scene where styles and influences blend and evolve much faster.
Right.
So,
Esparza then dives into the world of alternative comedy.
yeah,
And this is where it gets really interesting. He compares Brian Holloman, a comedian he really admires, to the shock comedy duo Otto and George,
right.
describing them both as brilliant but too weird for mainstream success back then.
Yeah.
And then he drops this line, Holzman is way funnier in person. It made me wonder if certain types of comedy just don't translate well to TV.
It's a great question, and it speaks to that changing landscape of comedy. The internet has allowed comedians like Holzman to cultivate their own niche audience without needing the validation of a TV deal or a movie role.
Right,
Someone who might have been deemed too unconventional for television
right.
can now sell out shows at the Comedy Store.
Right, exactly. Esparza also brings up Mitch Hedberg and his unique style, you know, all those non sequiturs delivered with his back to the audience.
Right.
Can you imagine that working today with the kind of attention spans people have?
You know, it's a completely different era for audience engagement.
Right.
Hedberg's style, while brilliant in its time, relied on a slower pace and a certain absurdist sensibility that might not resonate as strongly with today's audiences. You know, it makes you think about how comedy reflects the social and cultural norms of its time.
Right.
Humor evolves just like everything else.
Right, exactly. Then he starts talking about ventriloquism and prop comedy.
Oh, yeah.
And I was hooked. He mentions Jeff Dunham's success and how it seems like he's the only big ventriloquist act left.
It's interesting.
Same with Carrot Top and props.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if those styles have become so intrinsically linked to those specific performers
Right.
that it's almost impossible for anyone else to break through.
That's a really intriguing point.
Right.
It raises questions about the nature of innovation and homage in the entertainment industry.
Right.
Does the immense success of certain acts in niche styles create a barrier to entry for newcomers?
Right.
Or does it inspire a new generation to reinterpret and reimagine those styles for a modern audience?
Right. Well, speaking of unusual comedy acts, Esparza then shares some pretty wild stories about the late comedian Otto
Right.
from Otto and George, the shock comedy duo we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And this is where we get a glimpse into the sometimes dark and unsettling world of comedy.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Esparza's stories about Otto, they really blur the line between performance and reality.
Right.
He believes that Otto genuinely thought the dummy George was actually alive.
Wow.
And that story about Otto checking on the dummy in the trunk of a car,
Yeah.
it sounds like something straight out of a dark comedy film.
Right. It makes you wonder about the psychological toll that inhabiting a character so intensely can take on a performer, especially when that character is as, let's say, unconventional as Otto.
Right, and it also raises questions about the nature of comedy itself and where we draw the line between humor and the macabre.
Right. From the bizarre world of Otto and George, we then take a sharp turn into history.
Yeah.
And this is where things get really fascinating and maybe a little bit gross.
Okay.
Esparza paints a pretty vivid picture of sanitation, or the lack thereof, in the 1800s.
He really doesn't hold back, does he?
No, he doesn't. Esparza describes a time when people were literally living in their own filth with raw sewage running through the streets. He even uses the term night soil to describe human waste, which, let's be honest, is a pretty polite way of putting it.
It's a very delicate way to put it, yeah.
And this isn't just some abstract history lesson. Esparza brings it home by mentioning that a president might have actually died from drinking contaminated water near the White House.
Wow.
Talk about a wake-up call to be grateful for indoor plumbing.
Right. It's a stark reminder of how far we've come in terms of public health and sanitation.
Yeah.
I mean, the conditions that Esparza describes were truly horrific.
Yeah.
And it's no wonder that disease was rampant back then.
Right.
You know, it makes you appreciate the modern infrastructure that we often take for granted.
Right. And just when you think it can't get any wilder, Esparza brings up the Mr. Hands story.
Ah, yes.
The infamous Mr. Hands. It's certainly not a story for the faint of heart.
No, it's not.
To put it mildly, for those who haven't heard of it, and I'm not sure if I should even be describing this, but it involves a man who, well, let's just say he died from having sex with a horse.
Yeah.
It's a tragic case that gained notoriety due to its shocking and frankly disturbing nature. It's a reminder that the world is full of complexities and that human behavior can sometimes be inexplicable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Esparza goes into some detail about the case, mentioning that the man was a Boeing engineer. I mean, you'd think someone with that kind of intelligence would know better.
It just goes to show that intelligence and decision-making aren't always perfectly aligned. Human behavior is influenced by a complex interplay of factors, including biology, psychology, and social conditioning. You know, it's not always as straightforward as we'd like to think.
Right. He even mentioned that the guy had apparently lost the ability to experience certain sensations after a motorcycle accident. That detail, if true, adds another layer of complexity to the story. It suggests that the individual might have been seeking out extreme sensations to compensate for a loss of physical feeling, or perhaps as a way of coping with trauma or emotional distress.
Right.
And it gets even more disturbing. They found hundreds of VHS tapes and DVDs at his house, all filled with footage of him engaging in bestiality.
Right.
This discovery raises concerns about the potential for such material to be shared and exploited online.
Yeah.
And it highlights the clandestine nature of zoophilia and the lengths to which individuals might go to conceal their activities.
Right.
Esparza describes the Mr. Hands video in pretty graphic detail, emphasizing the sheer size and anatomy of the horse involved. And I have to say, it was a lot to take in.
Yeah, it's definitely not for the squeamish. But it does raise important questions about the ethical treatment of animals and the motivations behind such behavior.
Right. And then just when you think we're done with the disturbing stuff, they get into a discussion about the legality of bestiality. And it turns out it's still legal in some states. That's right. The legal status of bestiality varies widely across the United States, reflecting differing societal views on animal welfare and the boundaries of acceptable sexual behavior. It's a complex issue with legal, ethical, and cultural dimensions. It's just mind-boggling that something like that could be legal anywhere in this day and age.
It's certainly a topic that sparks debate and strong opinions on both sides. But it's important to remember that laws are a reflection of societal values. And those values are constantly evolving. What was considered acceptable in the past may no longer be tolerated today.
Right. Okay, I think we need to take a breather after all that.
Yeah.
This deep dive has already taken us to some pretty unexpected places.
It has been quite a journey, but we've only just scratched the surface. There's much more to explore in this episode. From the world of comedy to the complexities of technology and the ethical dilemmas of modern life.
Right. Stay tuned, because this deep dive is about to get even more fascinating.
Yeah.
All right, I need to cleanse my mental palate after that last segment. So Esparza lightens the mood a little bit by talking about this prank
Okay.
where a guy called women at work and tricked them into cutting the heels off their shoes.
Oh, wow.
It sounds like a pretty mean-spirited prank, especially if those were expensive shoes.
Yeah.
But it does say something about the lengths people will go to for a laugh, or, you know, maybe just to exert some control over others.
Right, right.
And this whole shoe conversation got Esparza thinking about the differences between men's and women's footwear.
Yeah.
And he points out how lucky guys are that they don't have to wear high heels.
Yeah, it's a good observation. High heels are often seen as a symbol of femininity and elegance,
Right.
but they can also be incredibly uncomfortable and impractical.
Oh, yeah.
It's a good example of how societal expectations around gender and appearance can sometimes prioritize aesthetics over comfort and functionality.
Right. I've tried walking in high heels, and it's not easy.
Yeah.
Esparza even jokes about how women probably have a higher pain tolerance because they have to deal with childbirth and, high heels.
Right.
He's definitely exaggerating for comedic effect, but there's a kernel of truth there.
Yeah,
Women often have to navigate physical discomfort and pain as part of their lived experiences.
for sure.
And from his shoes, we somehow jump to makeup.
Okay.
Esparza wonders what it would be like if guys had to wear makeup every day.
Interesting.
I'm not sure if I'd be up for that.
It's an interesting thought experiment that challenges traditional gender norms around appearance.
Right.
It makes you think about the time, effort, and expense that goes into maintaining certain beauty standards.
Right. And he brings up a valid point about the chemicals in makeup.
Yeah.
Are we potentially sacrificing our health for the sake of beauty?
It's a question worth considering. The beauty industry is largely unregulated,
Right.
and many cosmetic products contain ingredients that can be harmful with prolonged use.
Right.
It's always a good idea to research the products you use and be aware of the potential risks.
Okay, ready for another wild topic jump. Esparza then shifts gears completely and starts talking about Israel Adesanya, the UFC fighter,
Okay.
and his amazing comeback victory after being knocked down multiple times.
Oh, wow.
Esparza was clearly impressed by Adesanya's resilience and determination.
Yeah.
It's a classic underdog story, and Esparza really connected with Adesanya's post-fight speech about never giving up on your dreams.
Right.
I love that quote from Adesanya. If you're going to go all the way or don't even try.
It's inspiring.
Yeah, it's a powerful message that resonates beyond the world of sports. It's about pushing yourself beyond your limits, embracing challenges, and committing fully to your goals.
Absolutely.
And this somehow leads Esparza to talk about Charles Bukowski, the writer.
Okay.
Known for his gritty, hard-looking style, talk about a random connection.
Yeah, Esparza sees a parallel between Adesanya's fighting spirit and Bukowski's unapologetic approach to writing.
Okay.
They both represent a certain kind of authenticity and a refusal to compromise their vision.
Right. Esparza talks about how Bukowski's writing, which often depicted the underbelly of Los Angeles,
Yeah.
resonated with him on a deep level. And then he mentions that Bukowski himself was inspired by another LA writer named John Fonte.
It's fascinating how creative inspiration can flow from one generation to the next.
Yeah.
Fonte was a bit of an unsung hero,
Right.
but his work resonated with Bukowski, who then went on to inspire countless others.
Right. And Esparza contrasts these guys who worked regular jobs and still managed to create powerful art
Yeah.
with today's TikTokers at BOA.
Yeah.
What do you think he means by that?
It's a commentary on the changing landscape of creative expression and the allure of fame and fortune,
Yeah.
He's suggesting that in today's social media-driven world, there's often a focus on instant gratification and superficiality,
Right.
rather than the hard work and dedication it takes to create truly meaningful art.
Right. It's interesting to think about how the platforms we use to express ourselves can shape the art we create. Speaking of which, Esparza shares a story about getting a book deal,
Okay.
but ultimately giving the money back.
What?
He just wasn't comfortable with the publisher's vision for the book, which involved transcribing his stand-up routines.
Interesting. It shows that he's not just in it for the money.
Right.
He's an artist who wants to maintain control over his work
Yeah.
and ensure that it's presented in a way that he feels is authentic.
Right. And the publisher tried to use George Carlin as an example,
Yeah.
but Esparza wasn't having it.
Yeah.
He knew that stand-up is a performance art that doesn't translate well to the written page.
It takes guts to walk away from a book deal, especially early in your career.
Right.
But Esparza trusted his instincts and prioritized his artistic integrity over financial gain.
Right. It's funny how Esparza's mind works.
Yeah,
From
yeah.
book deals, he jumps to talking about coal trains he saw in Seattle
Okay.
and how surprised he was that the coal was being shipped to China.
Interesting.
It makes you wonder what they know that we don't.
He definitely has a curious mind.
Yeah.
It's a good example of how seemingly random observations can spark bigger questions about global trade, energy consumption, and the interconnectedness of the world.
Right. And then he brings up the COVID-19 pandemic and how it exposed the fragility of our global supply chains.
Right.
Suddenly, we couldn't get basic goods because so much manufacturing was concentrated in other countries.
It was a wake-up call for a lot of us.
Right.
We realized how reliant we had become on other countries for essential goods.
Right.
The pandemic forced us to reevaluate our economic systems and consider the need for greater resilience and diversification.
Right. Okay, ready for another technology tangent?
Sure.
Esparza proudly proclaims that he's still rocking a Samsung phone and hasn't succumbed to the iPhone craze.
It's kind of a statement, isn't it?
Yeah.
In a world dominated by Apple products, Esparza's choice to stick with Samsung suggests a certain independent streak
Right.
and a willingness to go against the grain.
Yeah, he's particularly impressed with the AI features on his Samsung,
Okay.
especially the website Summarizer.
Interesting.
It makes you wonder if we're becoming too reliant on AI to do all thinking for us.
It's a valid concern. As AI becomes more sophisticated,
Right.
it's important to strike a balance between utilizing its benefits and maintaining our critical thinking skills.
Right.
We don't want to outsource our ability to analyze information and form our own opinions.
Right. And then he throws a bit of a curveball.
Okay.
He talks about a Harvard student who figured out how to use facial recognition software with those Meta glasses to instantly access someone's online information. It sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
It's a perfect example of how technology can be both incredibly beneficial and potentially invasive.
Right.
Facial recognition technology raises serious concerns about privacy and surveillance in the digital age.
Right.
Where do we draw the line between innovation and the protection of our personal information?
Right. It reminds me of that movie They Live, where those special sunglasses let you see the aliens hiding in plain sight. It's a classic film that plays on our fears about hidden agendas and those in power potentially controlling us.
It's interesting how those fears have persisted and maybe even intensified in the digital age.
Right.
We're constantly bombarded with information and often feel like we're losing control over our data and privacy.
Right. Speaking of technology overload, Esparza then shares a story about a friend of his who switched back to a flip phone
Oh, wow.
just to escape the constant distractions of smartphones.
It's a growing trend.
Right.
More and more people are embracing digital minimalism as a way to reclaim their time and attention.
Right.
They're tired of being glued to their screens and want to simplify their lives.
I can't imagine going back to a flip phone at this point, but I do understand the appeal of disconnecting from the digital world now and then.
It's all about finding a balance. Technology can be an incredible tool, but it's important to use it consciously
Right.
and not let it control our lives.
Right. Esparza then takes us on a little detour into the world of shoplifting. He admits to stealing candy bars as a kid, which, come on, who hasn't?
It's a pretty relatable confession.
Right.
Most of us have engaged in some minor acts of rebellion in our youth.
Right, but then he mentions a comedian he knows who used to steal lighters from 7-Eleven.
Really?
Even though he was wealthy, it seems like he was doing it just for the thrill of it.
It's a good example of how compulsive behaviors can drive people to do things that seem illogical or even self-destructive.
Right.
Sometimes it's not about the material gain, but the rush of adrenaline or the sense of control that comes from breaking the rules.
Right. He even describes how this comedian would distract the cashier with hand movements while slipping lighters into his pocket.
It sounds like he had it down to a science.
Yeah.
But it also raises the question of why someone would go to such lengths for something so trivial.
Right.
What's the underlying motivation?
Esparza then jokes about how road comics used to have contests to see who could shoplift the most stuff from gas stations.
It's a funny story, but it also speaks to a certain culture of rule-breaking and maybe a bit of a disregard for authority that's often associated with the comedy world.
Right. And speaking of gas stations, Esparza then launches into a tangent about gas station food,
Okay.
reminiscing about those late-night meals on the road.
Yeah, it's a classic road comic experience.
Right.
Those long drives between gigs often involve grabbing whatever sustenance you can find at a gas station.
Right. He's surprised by how good the food can be at some gas stations.
Really?
Mentioning tacos and fried chicken as unexpected highlights.
It's a reminder that we shouldn't judge a book by its cover or a gas station by its gas pumps.
Right.
You can find hidden culinary gems in the most unexpected places.
Right, and from gas stations, we somehow end up talking about Buc-ee's, the Texas-based convenience store chain.
Okay.
Known for its massive size and, its beaver mascot.
Esparza's mind works in mysterious ways,
It does.
but it's a testament to his conversational style, which effortlessly jumps between seemingly unrelated topics, finding humor and connections in unexpected places.
He brings up a lawsuit that Buc-ee's filed against a Mexican convenience store chain called Lucky for trademark infringement.
Interesting.
Apparently, Buc-ee's claimed that Lucky copied their logo, which features a smiling beaver wearing a red cap.
It's a classic case of brand protection in a globalized marketplace.
Right.
Companies are increasingly vigilant about safeguarding their intellectual property,
Right.
and sometimes those efforts can lead to legal battles.
Esparza was skeptical of Buki's claim, arguing that you can't own the idea of a cute animal in a logo.
Yeah,
I mean, there are only so many animals out there, right?
it's a valid point. Where do we draw the line between inspiration and imitation?
Right.
Trademark law can be a complex and sometimes subjective area,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to design elements.
He even jokes about how Bukis could get sued by the creators of Curious George if they ever opened a store called George's.
It's a funny thought. But it also highlights the potential for trademark disputes to arise from seemingly innocuous similarities.
Right.
It's a reminder that businesses need to be careful about protecting their brand identity
Right.
and conducting thorough trademark searches before launching new products or services.
And then Esparza remembers another lawsuit involving a comedy club owner
Okay.
who got sued by the estate of Laurel and Hardy
Oh, wow.
for using their likeness in his logo.
Interesting.
It just goes to show that intellectual property law can be a minefield, even for comedians.
It's a good reminder that even comedic inspiration needs to be handled with respect for copyright and trademark laws.
Right.
The line between homage and infringement can sometimes be blurry,
Yeah.
and it's always best to err on the side of caution.
Esparza then has this funny thought experiment.
Okay.
He imagines showing someone with no knowledge of American culture a Laurel and Hardy film,
Okay.
followed by Dave Chappelle's blind white supremacist character, Clayton Bigsby.
It's a brilliant juxtaposition that highlights the evolution of comedy and the changing societal norms surrounding humor.
Right.
What was considered acceptable in the past might be viewed as offensive or insensitive today.
Right. It makes you think about how humor reflects the merits and anxieties of its time.
Yeah, for sure.
And from comedy lawsuits, we then jump to a discussion about The Passion of the Christ,
Okay.
Mel Gibson's film about the crucifixion of Jesus.
Again, we see Esparza's mind making these seemingly random connections.
Yeah.
It's part of what makes his conversations so engaging.
He talks about watching the film in the original Aramaic language,
Wow.
which he found to be a powerful and immersive experience.
It's interesting how language can impact our perception of a film.
Right.
Hearing the dialogue in the original language can add a layer of authenticity and emotional depth.
Right. And he contrasts this with films like Game of Thrones, where everyone speaks with an English accent, even if they're supposed to be from different parts of the world.
It's a common practice in film and television, often done for the sake of accessibility and budget constraints.
Right.
But it can sometimes create a sense of disconnect between the characters and their supposed cultural backgrounds.
Right. He even jokes that if The Devil and The Exorcist had an Irish accent, it wouldn't have been as scary.
It's a funny observation that highlights the power of accents and dialects
Yeah.
to shape our perceptions of characters and evoke certain emotions.
Right.
Some accents are just inherently scarier than others.
Okay, this is a classic Esparza transition.
Okay,
From the devil's accent, he jumps to talking about Mike Tyson's voice and how it was easy to make fun of.
right. But he also points out that no one dared to mock Tyson to his face
Right.
because, well, he was Mike Tyson.
Exactly. It's a reminder that appearances can be deceiving.
Right.
Sometimes the people who seem the most gentle or unassuming can possess incredible strength or power.
It's a good lesson to learn. Never underestimate anyone,
Right.
regardless of their voice or demeanor.
From Mike Tyson's voice, we then transition to a discussion about smoking pipes.
Okay.
It's amazing how Esparza's mind can jump from one topic to another so effortlessly.
It's like a stream of consciousness, but somehow it all works.
Yeah.
It's a testament to his natural charisma and his ability to find humor and connections in the most unexpected places.
He talks about how Joe Rogan gave him a pipe once, but he ended up ruining it because he let too many people smoke out of it.
Sounds like a classic case of too many cooks in the kitchen, or rather, too many smokers on the pipe.
Right, but it's also a reminder of the importance of respecting personal boundaries and property.
Right.
They then get into a discussion about the proper way to light a cigar, with Esparza explaining that some people use cedar strips to avoid getting butane fumes from a lighter.
It reveals a whole subculture of cigar aficionados
Right.
who take their smoking rituals very seriously.
Yeah.
They're meticulous about every detail, from the type of lighter to the way the cigar is cut,
Esparza jokes about how these guys are super nerds when it comes to cigars.
all in good fun.
Yeah.
But it does highlight the passion and dedication that some people have for their hobbies.
Right.
And it's a reminder that there are communities and subcultures built around even the most niche interests.
And then they get into a debate about whether butane lighters are actually bad for you. It's one of those everyday things that we don't often think about.
Right.
But, it's worth considering the potential health risks of even seemingly mundane activities.
It's a good reminder to be mindful of our surroundings.
Right.
And to stay informed about potential hazards.
Right.
Even those that seem insignificant.
And from cigars, we somehow jump to scented candles.
Another unexpected transition.
It is a classic Esparza transition. You never know where he's going to take you next.
He's full of surprises.
He asks Joe Rogan to Google whether scented candles are unhealthy.
Okay.
Which sparks a debate about the safety of paraffin wax, the most common type of wax used in candles.
It's a question that many people have these days.
Yeah.
We're becoming more aware of the potential health risks associated with common household products, and candles are no exception.
They read an article that claims paraffin wax, which is derived from petroleum,
right,
releases harmful chemicals when burned.
Interesting.
It's a little unsettling to think that something that's supposed to create a relaxing atmosphere could actually be polluting our homes.
It's a reminder to be mindful of the products we bring into our homes and to research the ingredients of potential risks.
Right.
Just because something is widely available doesn't necessarily mean they're safe.
Right. They then debate whether there are any safe alternatives to paraffin candles, with Esparza expressing skepticism about soy wax, beeswax, and other natural options. He just doesn't buy it.
It's good to be skeptical.
Yeah.
Marketing claims can be misleading.
Right.
And the candle industry is no exception.
Right.
It's important to do your own research.
Right.
And not just accept claims at face value.
He points out that the National Candle Association, which is the trade group for candle manufacturers, insists that candles are safe, but he's not convinced.
Yeah.
He thinks they're just trying to detect their industry.
It's understandable to be wary of information coming from industry groups, as they often have a vested interest in promoting their products.
Right.
Even if there are potential risks.
Esparza then lightens the mood by joking about how a girl he used to date burned her house down with candles.
Oh, no.
It's a funny anecdote, but it also serves as a reminder that even seemingly harmless objects can be dangerous if used improperly.
Yeah.
Fire safety is important no matter how romantic those flickering candles might seem.
Right.
Okay, from candles, we then jump to, wait for it, paper straws.
Another unexpected transition, but that's Esparza for you.
It is. He's full of surprises.
Yeah.
He brings up the whole controversy around paper straws and how they were supposed to be a more environmentally friendly alternative to plastic straws.
Right.
But then, plot twist.
Okay.
They read an article that claims paper straws actually contain more forever chemicals than plastic straws.
It's a classic example of how well-intentioned environmental efforts can sometimes have unintended consequences.
Yeah.
It also highlights the complexity of evaluating the environmental impact of different materials and manufacturing processes.
Right. For those who aren't familiar with the term forever chemicals, refers to a group of man-made substances, also known as PFAS, that don't break down in the environment and can accumulate in our bodies, potentially causing all sorts of health problems.
It's a reminder that even seemingly small choices, like the type of straw we use, can have far-reaching consequences for our health and the environment.
They then have this funny debate about whether we should just give up on straws altogether.
It's a humorous take on a serious issue.
Yeah.
The proliferation of single-use plastics is a huge environmental problem.
Right.
And we need to find more sustainable solutions.
And then Esparza Ever, the comedian, brings up the potential dangers of metal straws.
Okay.
Especially if you're clumsy. Right. He even jokes about someone tripping and falling on a metal straw and impaling themselves in the face.
It's a gruesome image, but it highlights the fact that even seemingly harmless objects can pose a risk if used improperly.
Okay, enough with the straw talk. Esparza then takes us back to his childhood.
Okay.
Describing a brutal game he used to play called Webos.
Okay.
Which involved throwing a tennis ball at each other.
Oh, wow.
It sounds a bit rough.
Yeah.
It's a glimpse into a time when kids were less supervised and more likely to engage in unstructured outdoor play, even if it sometimes got a little dangerous.
The goal of the game was to hit someone in the back with the ball before they reached the wall.
Right.
And if you got hit 4 times, everyone got to pelt you with the tennis ball while you stood against the wall.
It sounds like a recipe for some serious bruises.
Yeah.
But it also speaks to a certain resilience and acceptance of physical discomfort that was more common among kids in the past.
For sure.
He then reminisces about other childhood games like stickball and over the line.
Yeah.
Those classic street games that kids used to play before video games and smartphones took over.
It's a bit nostalgic, isn't it?
It is.
Those games fostered creativity, teamwork, and a sense of community.
Right.
Kids had to use their imaginations and adapt to their surroundings.
Right. And then in classic Esparza fashion, he circles back to shoplifting.
Okay.
Wondering if kids still do it for fun like they used to.
It's interesting how certain themes keep recurring in his conversation. observations,
Yeah.
even if they seem unrelated at first glance.
He even tells another story about that comedian who used to steal lighters from 7-Eleven,
Oh, yeah.
describing in detail how he would distract the cashier and slip the lighters into his pocket.
It's a bit like a magic trick,
Yeah,
but with a criminal twist.
right. But it also raises the question of why someone who clearly didn't need to steal would engage in such behavior.
Right.
What's the psychological payoff?
Yeah.
He then jokes about how road comics used to have contests to see who could shoplift the most stuff from gas stations.
It's a funny story, but it also speaks to the subculture of comedy and the camaraderie that often develops among comedians
Yeah.
who are constantly on the road sharing experiences and pushing each other's boundaries.
From shoplifting, we then transition to another unexpected topic, hygiene and sanitation in the past.
Esparza has a knack for taking us on these wild intellectual roller coasters.
He does.
Just when you think you know where the conversation is headed, he throws a curveball.
He talks about how people were essentially living in their own filth back in the 1800s with raw sewage running through the streets.
Yeah, it's a far cry from our modern sanitized world.
It is. He even reads a passage from an 1882 account of New York City describing the overwhelming stench of human waste that permeated the air.
It's enough to make you gag just thinking about it.
And get this, they used to call human waste night soil and use it as fertilizer. Can you imagine spreading that stuff on your garden today?
It might sound disgusting to us now, but it was a common practice in the past.
Right.
It highlights the resourcefulness of people in a time when waste disposal options were limited.
He then drops this bombshell. A president might have actually died from drinking contaminated water near the White House.
Wow.
Talk about the wake-up call to be grateful for clean water.
It's a shocking reminder that even those in positions of power were not immune to the health risks posed by inadequate sanitation.
Right.
It underscores the importance of public health infrastructure
Right.
and the role it plays in safeguarding our well-being.
It's amazing to think that they had the technology to build elaborate structures like the White House,
Right.
but couldn't figure out basic sanitation.
Yeah, it's a reminder that technological progress doesn't always happen in a linear or logical fashion.
Right. Sometimes societies prioritize grand projects and innovations while neglecting basic necessities.
Yeah,
It's a good reminder to consider the full spectrum of human needs
right.
and to ensure that progress benefits everyone,
Right.
not just a select few.
And just when you think we've covered the grossest topics imaginable, Esparza brings up condoms in the 1800s,
Oh, no.
which, brace yourself, were made from sheepskin.
The history of contraception is fascinating and often a bit cringeworthy.
Yeah.
Early condoms were a far cry from the safe and effective options we have today.
He even describes a scene from a movie where a woman was washing a sheepskin condom after a man threw it at her face.
It's a pretty disturbing image.
It highlights the often crude and unsanitary practices associated with sex and contraception in the past.
Right.
It's a reminder that even the most intimate aspects of human life have been shaped by cultural norms and technological advancements.
Okay, are you ready to dive back into some potentially unsettling territory?
Let's do it.
Esparza then brings up the topic of liquid human remains, which sounds like something straight out of a horror movie.
It's a term that's becoming more common as a method of disposing of human remains, known as alkaline hydrolysis, gains traction.
Right.
It's essentially a process of breaking down the body using a combination of water, alkali, and heat.
And Esparza claims that some companies are boiling down bodies and turning them into fertilizer.
Yeah, alkaline hydrolysis does involve breaking down the body into its basic chemical components,
Right.
and the resulting liquid can be used as fertilizer. It's a more environmentally friendly alternative to traditional burial or cremation, but it does raise some ethical questions.
He brings up an Instagram post where someone claimed they were making fertilizer and supplements from human remains.
That's pretty disturbing.
It is a pretty disturbing thought.
It definitely taps into our anxieties about the commodification of human remains and the potential for exploitation.
Right.
The idea of our bodies being used for commercial purposes after death raises questions about consent, respect for the deceased, and the limits of scientific innovation.
This whole conversation made me wonder if companies are required to disclose whether the fertilizer they're selling is made from human remains. I mean, wouldn't you want to know?
It's a valid question and one that highlights the need for greater transparency in product labeling.
Right.
Currently, there are no federal regulations requiring specific disclosures about the source of ingredients in fertilizers.
And then Esparza digs up an article from 1888 stating that people have been boiling down bodies and turning them into fertilizer since the 1800s.
Wow.
It's mind-boggling that they had the technology to do that back then.
Yeah.
But not basic indoor plumbing.
It's a curious juxtaposition, isn't it?
It is.
It suggests that the priorities of past societies were sometimes quite different from our own.
Right.
And it's a reminder that innovation doesn't always follow a linear or predictable path.
He then breaks down the process of alkaline hydrolysis, explaining how they extract all sorts of substances from the bodies, including water, salt, sugars, amino acids, peptides, and calcium phosphate.
It's amazing what we can do with technology these days.
Yeah.
But it also raises questions about the ethical implications of these advancements.
Right.
Should there be limits on what we can do with human remains?
Right.
Who gets to decide?
And they then debate whether companies should be required to disclose if the calcium in their supplements is sourced from human remains.
Interesting.
It's a thought-provoking question that goes to the heart of consumer rights and informed consent.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Right.
On the one hand, consumers have a right to know what's in the products they're consuming.
Right.
On the other hand, there's the question of whether such a disclosure would stigmatize a perfectly safe and sustainable practice.
Esparza, ever the provocateur, then jokes that some companies would probably sell more supplements if they marketed them as being made from dead people.
It's a darkly humorous observation.
It is.
That speaks to our fascination with the macabre.
Right.
And the potential for companies to exploit those tendencies for profit.
From fertilizer, we then take another sharp turn into even more unsettling territory.
Okay.
Esparza starts talking about cannibalism and the diseases associated with it, specifically Kuru, that fatal neurodegenerative disease that was prevalent among a tribe in Papua New Guinea who practiced ritualistic cannibalism.
It's a fascinating, albeit disturbing example of how cultural practices can have unintended consequences.
Right.
Kuru was transmitted through the consumption of infected brain tissue,
right,
highlighting the risks of consuming human flesh.
He then brings up the movie Soylent Green, that dystopian classic where people are unknowingly eating protein biscuits made from human remains.
It's a classic cautionary tale about overpopulation and the lengths to which societies might go to sustain themselves.
Right. It taps into our primal fears about food scarcity and the dehumanizing potential of technology.
For sure, it's a reminder that even in the face of existential threats, we must hold on to our humanity and ethical principles.
He then mentions another movie, Microwave Massacre.
Okay.
About a guy who kills his wife, microwaves her body, and then brings her remains to work in his lunch.
It's a darkly comedic take on the horror genre, exploring themes of domestic violence, cannibalism, and the breakdown of social norms.
And then just when you think it can't get any weirder, he shares a real-life story about a woman who killed her husband and served him to her neighbors.
It's a horrifying story that speaks to the darkest impulses of human nature and the capacity for violence and betrayal even within intimate relationships.
All right. After that deep dive into the darker side of humanity, I'm ready for something a little lighter.
Yeah, me too.
Thankfully, Esparza delivers.
Okay.
He starts talking about Elvis Presley and the controversy surrounding his hip movements back in the 1950s.
Oh, yeah, it's hard to believe now.
I know.
But Elvis's dance moves were considered downright scandalous back then, you know?
Yeah.
He was shaking things up, literally, and challenging the conservative social norms of the time.
Right.
It's a reminder of how much cultural attitudes towards dance and music have changed over the years.
Esparza mentions that Elvis was actually censored on The Ed Sullivan Show.
Wow.
They only showed him from the waist up.
Really?
Because his hip movements were deemed too suggestive for television audiences.
Can you imagine that happening today?
I know, it's crazy.
It seems so absurd.
It does.
But it reflects the anxieties surrounding rock and roll music at the time.
Right.
And the perceived threat it posed to traditional values, you know.
Yeah.
There was a clash between generations and a battle over what was considered appropriate entertainment.
It's fascinating how certain forms of expression can become lightning rods for cultural debates.
Yeah.
And speaking of cultural shifts, Esparza then takes us on a bit of a tangent about the evolution of Fox, the television network.
It's another one of those unexpected topic jumps that Esparza is known for.
Right.
But somehow it all ties together.
He reminisces about how Fox was known for its edgy and irreverent shows back in the day, like Married with Children and The Simpsons.
Yeah, those were classics.
I know they were pushing the boundaries of what was considered accessible on television.
Right.
And audiences loved it.
Fox emerged as a disruptor in the television landscape,
Yeah.
challenging the dominance of the established networks with its more daring and often controversial programming.
Right.
It was a reflection of the changing tastes of viewers who are looking for something different,
Right.
something that reflected their own cynicism and sense of humor.
But then he points out how Fox's programming has shifted over the years, becoming more associated with conservative news and commentary.
It's a pretty dramatic change from its early days as a bastion of counterculture programming.
It is. It's a reflection of the broader media landscape where the lines between news and entertainment have become increasingly blurred.
Right.
And it highlights the challenges of maintaining objectivity in a world where partisan bias and political polarization have become so pervasive.
It's interesting to think about how media outlets evolve over time, reflecting the changing cultural and political landscape.
And speaking of shows that push the boundaries of comedy, Esparza brings up In Living Color.
Oh, yeah? That was a great show.
The groundbreaking sketch comedy show that launched the careers of so many talented comedians, including the Wayans brothers and Jim Carrey.
In Living Color was a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah.
Known for its diverse cast, sharp social commentary, and willingness to tackle sensitive topics head-on.
Right.
It was a show that made you laugh and think at the same time.
Yeah.
And it paved the way for a new wave of diverse and often provocative comedy.
But Esparza also acknowledges that some of the sketches on In Living Color would probably be considered too offensive for today's audiences.
Yeah, times have definitely changed.
It's a reminder of how standards of humor evolve over time,
Right.
reflecting changing social norms and greater awareness of social justice issues.
It's a constant balancing act for comedians.
Right.
How do you push the boundaries of humor without crossing the line into offensiveness?
Yeah.
It's a question that every comedian grapples with, and there's no easy answer.
Esparza specifically mentions the infamous sketch where Damon Wiccan's character Handeman suddenly becomes heterosexual after the camera falls on him.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
It was a satire of homophobia.
Right.
But it's a sketch that would likely be met with criticism today.
It highlights the importance of context and intent in comedy.
Right.
What might have been intended as a satirical commentary on prejudice can still perpetuate harmful stereotypes, even if that wasn't the intention.
And of course, you can't talk about In Living Color without mentioning Jim Carrey's iconic character, Fire Marshal Bill.
Oh, yeah, let me show you something.
I know, right? Fire Marshal Bill was a perfect example of Carrey's over-the-top physical comedy style.
Yeah, for sure.
It was hilarious at the time, but it's also a character that might not age well,
Right.
considering its potential to be seen as insensitive towards burn victims.
It's interesting to think about how comedy can both reflect and challenge social norms, sometimes simultaneously.
Right, and from In Living Color, they go on to discuss other great sketch comedy shows, including Saturday Night Live, Mad TV, SCTV, Kids in the Hall, and The State.
It's a testament to the enduring appeal of sketch comedy.
Right.
It's a genre that allows comedians to experiment, to play with different characters and scenarios,
Right.
and to satirize everything from current events to human nature itself.
Esparza then gives a shout-out to a YouTube comedy duo called Gillis and Keys, mentioning a sketch where they play OnlyFans dads.
It's a reminder of how the internet has democratized comedy,
Yeah.
allowing creators to bypass traditional gatekeepers and connect directly with their audience.
And it's also a reflection of the evolving landscape of comedy, where new platform and formats are constantly emerging, pushing boundaries and redefining what it means to be funny.
Absolutely.
And with that, Esparza wraps up the podcast by plugging his latest Netflix special, Raging Fool.
Nice.
It's a reminder that behind all the tangents and digressions, he's a talented comedian with a successful career,
Right?
and he knows how to use platforms like podcasts to promote his work.
Well, this has been a wild ride.
It has.
From Elvis's hips to liquid human remains.
It just goes to show that you never know where these deep dives will take you.
That's the beauty of it. They challenge our assumptions, expose us to new ideas, and make us think critically about the world around us.
Right.
Until next time, keep exploring, stay curious, and remember to laugh along the way.
Thanks for joining us.